What if I told you that one humid night in Manila, a Brazilian fighter walked into an arena believing he could break not just a man, but the spirit of an entire nation? What if I told you he mocked Filipino faith, their quiet devotion, their stubborn hope, and the crowd answered him not with hatred, but with a stillness he could not understand? He thought it was weakness. He thought he was already victorious. This is the story of how one fight in Manila became less about violence and more about a soul being confronted by a truth he never saw coming. Rafael Costa arrived in Manila with the presence of someone who had spent years learning to turn his own body into a myth. At 32, he had become the kind of fighter who stepped through airport terminals like a moving headline. His name alone filled arenas from Rio to Tokyo. Photographers rushed to capture the angle of his jaw, the intensity of his eyes, the way his stride seemed to carry an old, invisible hunger. On camera he looked invincible, carved from discipline and defiance, but beneath the surface lived a man who had been running for so long he no longer remembered what stillness felt like. He had perfected the art of appearing whole, while quietly fracturing in places no one could see. He had risen from a childhood shaped by danger and scarcity, where survival demanded steel rather than softness. Fighting had been his escape, his ladder out of fear, his claim to a world that once tried to erase him. But somewhere along the climb, triumph had grown strangely weightless. Victory had stopped feeling like affirmation and started feeling like anesthesia, numbing him just long enough to postpone the questions waiting in the quiet. The luxury hotels, the sponsorships, the belts that gleamed in glass cases, none of them muted the emptiness that whispered through his life like a draft through an old house. He lived surrounded by noise, yet he felt perpetually unheard. Because stillness terrified him, he began to perform arrogance as a kind of armor. It was easier to provoke the world than let the world look too closely. So when interviews began for his Manila fight, he leaned into controversy with rehearsed ease. In front of reporters with lights reflecting off his confidence, he said, "Filipinos fight with heart, but heart can be broken." The room reacted instantly. The air tightened. Journalists exchanged startled glances. The clip spread online within minutes, sparking debates, criticisms, even anger. Some called him disrespectful. Others accused him of carrying the arrogance of conquerors who once underestimated the Filipino people. A few fans defended him, calling it mind games. Rafael pretended not to care. But as he walked out of the studio, his own words echoed with an unfamiliar dissonance, as if part of him already sensed he had spoken something untrue. His discomfort deepened during the first press conference when he finally came face to face with his Filipino opponent, Mateo Reyes. Rafael expected hostility, maybe bravado, something he could push against. Instead, he found a man whose presence carried a quiet gravity. Mateo stood with hands loosely folded, not in weakness but in a calm that felt disarming. When asked about Rafael's insult, Mateo did not bristle. He simply looked into the cameras and said, "A spirit is not something you break. It is something you either honor or wound. In my country, we learned that what stands before God does not bow before men." The room stilled. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as if capturing something sacred. Rafael held his smirk, but the words slipped under his skin with a strange and unwelcome clarity. He had spent years fighting men who wanted to beat him. He had never faced a man who simply refused to hate him. And somehow, that frightened him more than any punch. That night, his hotel room felt colder than usual. The walls were white, silent, sterile, in a way that made the city outside seem alive by contrast. From his window, he saw Manila glowing street vendors, still serving food under flickering lights. Jeepneys painted like moving murals. Children playing barefoot on narrow roads. And somewhere farther away, a chapel bell ringing through the humidity like a memory he didn't know he carried. For the first time in a long while, he felt small. Not in the humiliating way he once feared, but in the honest way a man feels when confronted with a truth larger than himself. He sat on the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, the persona stripped away for the night. He tried to replay his insult in his mind, tried to convince himself it was just strategy, but the justification rang hollow. If he were honest brutally, quietly honest, he knew the insult came not from confidence but from fear. Fear that maybe he lacked the very thing he mocked. Fear that heart, real heart, was something he had never learned to carry. The decision arrived like a slow, reluctant sunrise. He felt it before he understood it. He could not keep fighting the way he had fought before, not outwardly, not inwardly. Something in this city, in Mateo's words, in the stillness he kept trying to avoid, was calling him toward a truth he had long resisted. And so Rafael made a choice. He would step beyond the role he hid inside. He would face this nation, this opponent, this spirit he had mocked, not as a performer, but as a man who sensed he was standing at the threshold of a reckoning he could no longer postpone. Rafael's flight to Cebu left Manila just before dawn, the sky still dark enough that the city lights shimmered like a scattered constellation beneath him. He had insisted to his team that he wanted a day away from the capital before the final weigh-in, a reason that sounded practical, though he himself did not fully understand why he needed to leave. All he knew was that something in him felt pulled, drawn by a quiet gravity he could neither name nor resist. As the plane rose above the clouds, he closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, did not rehearse combinations or strategies. He simply breathed, as though relearning a forgotten skill. When the plane descended, morning light poured across the windows in soft gold. Cebu greeted him not with fanfare but with warmth that felt uncontrived, almost intimate. The humidity wrapped around him like a living presence. The airport was smaller, less polished, less curated for spectacle, and yet he felt more seen here than in any of the glamorous terminals he had passed through in his life. Outside, the air smelled of sea salt and early morning cooking oil heating in pans, rice steaming, bread baking somewhere unseen. Tricycles wove through the crowd with colorful rattles. Vendors set up their stalls with quiet determination. Life here did not pause for him, and that, strangely, felt like relief. His driver was an older man named Lito, sent by a local organizer. Lito greeted him with a smile that held no trace of awe or intimidation, only genuine hospitality. Rafael was used to reactions shaped by either fear or idolization. This simple dignity unsettled him. As they drove through narrow roads lined with sari-sari stores, children played barefoot near the shoreline, shouting to one another with unfiltered joy. A group of fishermen hauled in nets, dripping with morning catch, their silhouettes bent but steady. Every detail carried a sense of life lived without fracture, a life not crafted for cameras, not sharpened by survival in the way his had been. At a small village halfway up the coast, Lito stopped to buy water. Rafael stepped out of the van, stretching, letting the humid wind press against his skin. That was when he noticed a young boy sitting on a low wooden bench by the store. The child couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, a small plastic pail of mangoes beside him. His smile was bright, as if sunlight lived behind his teeth. He approached Rafael with a shyness that lasted only a second before turning into courage. "Sir, you want mango?" "Sweet, very sweet." Rafael smiled politely, ready to decline. But the boy continued, "My mama say if you give something with joy, God make it double." He said it as though repeating a truth older than himself. Rafael paused. The line was simple, easy, innocent, but it struck him with the force of something ancient. He bought 2 mangoes, not because he needed them, but because the boy's sincerity disarmed him. When he handed the child extra money, the boy shook his head fiercely and gave him 1 mango back. "My mama say no one should give too much. If you give too much, maybe you're sad." The sentence fell into Rafael's chest like a pebble into deep water. He had spent years giving too much aggression, too much bravado, too much performance. He wondered, for a moment, if the boy could see the sadness beneath his muscles. The drive continued, but something in him had already begun to soften. As they approached the coastline, the sea widened before him in a stretch of calm blue, its surface warm and familiar like a memory. He asked Lito to stop the car. He stepped out and walked toward the shore until the waves lapped gently at his shoes. The sound was rhythmic, ancient, a kind of prayer spoken without words. For several minutes he stood there, listening. The wind carried scents of salt and damp wood. The palm trees swayed in unhurried arcs, their leaves whispering secrets he could not yet understand. This moment held a strange stillness, not the emptiness of his hotel rooms, but a stillness that felt full, as though the world were offering him a silence meant to heal rather than hollow. His breath slowed, his shoulders lowered. He realized how long it had been since he allowed himself to simply exist without the weight of expectation. Later that day, Lito invited Rafael to join him for lunch at his sister's home. Normally Rafael would decline such invitations, preferring the isolation of hotel suites, but something guided him toward yes. When they entered the small home, the aroma of garlic and simmering broth filled the air. The family welcomed him without theatrics, pulling up a chair as though he were a long-lost relative rather than an international athlete. They said grace before eating, hands clasped, heads slightly bowed. Rafael watched the ritual with quiet curiosity. The prayer was simple, humble, free of performance. It was gratitude without pretense. It made him feel both tender and unsteady, like seeing something he had forgotten existed. Throughout the meal, no one asked for photos or autographs. They asked instead about his mother, his home, whether he liked the food, whether he slept well, whether he ever felt lonely. The questions reached toward him gently. As though they sought the man beneath the reputation, he felt seen in ways he had not prepared for. A moment arrived when Lito's sister said, "A man is strongest when he knows what he protects, not when he proves what he can destroy." It was spoken casually, mid-conversation, but the words echoed in him with unsettling clarity. He had spent years proving his strength through destruction. He wondered now if that had been the true source of his exhaustion. After lunch, Rafael walked alone toward the edge of the village where a small chapel stood, doors open to the breeze. Inside, candles flickered softly, light dancing across wooden pews. He sat in the back, unsure of why he felt compelled to enter. The chapel held no grandeur, no stained glass, no gold. Yet its simplicity felt sacred, as though it were built not to impress, but to shelter. For a long moment he closed his eyes. The sounds of the outside world faded until all that remained was the quiet beating of his heart, steady, persistent, asking to be acknowledged. He didn't pray. Not yet. He didn't know how, but he listened, and listening was already a kind of beginning. When he finally rose to leave, something inside him had shifted, subtle but undeniable. He couldn't explain it, couldn't name it, but he felt it, a loosening of something long clenched. He stepped back into the sunlight, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to shield himself from its warmth. He didn't know it then, but his heart had already begun to change. By the time Rafael returned to Manila, a stillness had settled inside him, though he did not yet understand its purpose. The coastal air of Cebu lingered in his lungs, warm, generous, unhurried, and it clashed sharply with the metallic chill of the capital. Manila was louder now. Banners bearing his face hung above the streets. Commentators argued on television about whether his insult had crossed the line. Every cab driver seemed to have an opinion about him. The noise pressed against him like a tightening grip, as if the city were reminding him that peace was not something one could borrow. It had to be earned. The morning before the fight, he went for a solitary run along the bay. The sun had barely risen, painting the sky in muted purples and grays. The water moved in slow, heavy breaths. At the far end of the path, he saw a small crowd gathered near the seawall. Their faces were somber. Their bodies were rigid with a collective grief. Something inside him tightened. He slowed, then stopped. A fisherman approached him, unfamiliar with who he was, and simply said, "There was an accident. A jeepney fell into the water." His voice carried the resignation of someone who had seen sorrow too often to be surprised by it. Rafael stepped closer. A crane was pulling the battered jeepney from the bay, water streaming from its broken windows. A woman near him wept softly, holding a small pair of slippers in her shaking hands. And then he saw a stretcher being lifted from the shoreline. A tiny body, covered, fragile, still, the same age as the mango-selling boy in Cebu. Something in him shattered. The pain did not come gradually. It struck like a fist to the chest, knocking the breath from him. The world blurred. He felt a tremor inside his bones, an ache he had spent decades concealing under layers of pride and violence. But here, before this loss that had nothing to do with him, he could not hide. The grief of strangers seeped into him as though it belonged to him. He remembered the boy's words, "If you give something with joy, God make it double," and for the first time he understood that the world also doubled sorrow. As emergency workers moved with quiet urgency, Rafael stepped back, overwhelmed. The woman with the slippers pressed them to her heart, whispering a prayer in broken breaths. He did not know the words, but he felt their weight. A mother begging God for a miracle already denied. He wanted to comfort her, but he realized with a sharp, humbling clarity that he had no language for compassion. He only knew how to fight, not how to hold another's suffering. For the first time in many years, he felt ashamed of the man he had become. He returned to his hotel in silence, walking rather than taking a car. The city's noises felt different, harsher, more intrusive. Every honk, every shout, every engine, every distant siren scraped against his still raw heart. When he reached his room, he sat on the floor, back against the wall, letting the event wash over him in waves that he could not stop. He had spent years mastering pain, but this pain was different. It was not inflicted by fists or bone. It was inflicted by humanity. Night fell heavy. The city outside pulsed with anticipation for tomorrow's fight, but he felt out of sync with the world that awaited him. He tried sleeping but couldn't. He tried focusing on strategy, but his mind wandered back to the mother's trembling hands. Eventually, close to midnight, he left the hotel and walked toward the old church he had passed days earlier. Its doors were open again. Candles flickered like soft breathing. Inside, he expected emptiness. Instead, he found Mateo. The Filipino fighter was seated alone in the front pew, body still, head bowed. He did not turn when Rafael entered. He seemed to sense him without needing to look. After a long pause, he said quietly, "You're not sleeping." Rafael walked farther in, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. "I saw something this morning," he managed. "A jeepney accident." His voice cracked unexpectedly. "A child." He swallowed hard. "I don't know why it hit me like that." Mateo turned toward him, and the chapel's faint light softened the edges of his face. "Because for the first time, you let yourself feel what you've been running from." Rafael looked down at his hands, hands that had built his life through force, hands that suddenly felt insufficient for anything gentle. "How do people here carry so much suffering?" he whispered. "And still keep their spirit?" Mateo's answer came with the calm certainty of someone shaped by storms. "Because spirit is not something we hold with our strength," he said. "It is something God holds for us when we cannot. Suffering breaks us open, yes, but only so light can enter." Rafael sank into the pew behind him. He felt stripped, not humiliated, but exposed in a way that carried the possibility of redemption. Something inside him, brittle and long ignored, cracked open. The stillness of the chapel wrapped around him like a gentle insistence. Then Mateo reached into his pocket and set a small, worn Bible on the pew. "There is a verse I keep with me," he said quietly. "It helped me when I lost someone I loved." He opened the page and pointed to a line, letting Rafael read it for himself. The words were simple, yet they moved through Rafael like a slow, steady flame. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Psalm 23:4. The verse landed inside him like an anchor in deep water, sinking, grounding, settling. He read it again, slower. And again, letting the meaning reach the parts of him he had walled off for years. He felt a sting behind his eyes, sharp and unexpected. A single tear fell before he could stop it. He wiped it quickly, embarrassed. Mateo did not judge him. "Strength without tenderness becomes cruelty," he said softly. "But strength softened by sorrow becomes compassion. And that is what God uses, is notations." Rafael closed his eyes, the verse echoing within him long after the sound of it faded. For the first time, he felt the possibility that his life did not have to be a war he fought alone. For the first time, he felt the faint outline of God, not as a doctrine, but as presence. They remained in the chapel until the candles waned. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The silence held them both. When Rafael stepped outside, the air felt different, not lighter, but clearer, as if the night itself had been washed. The city lights shimmered across the bay, and he breathed deeply, feeling a peace that did not erase pain but accompanied it. The mother's grief still lived inside him, but now it was joined by something else, something steadier, a quiet truth he could finally face. He walked back to the hotel without fear of the coming fight. Not because he expected to win, but because he no longer felt the need to prove himself through victory or destruction. Something deeper had awakened, not confidence, not pride, but a fragile, growing humility that made room for compassion. By the time he reached his room, the last tremors of panic had dissolved into a soft, reverent calm. He looked at his reflection in the window, and for the first time in his life, he saw not a fighter, but a man with a heart, slowly learning how to return home to itself. Peace did not arrive as a shout, nor as a triumph. It arrived as a whisper, and he welcomed it. The morning of the fight rose gently over Manila, its first light brushing the tops of buildings with a soft, amber glow. Rafael woke before the alarm. There was no panic inside him, no restless pacing, no trembling anticipation of violence. Instead, he felt an inner quiet that surprised him, a stillness that had nothing to do with victory or defeat. The room around him seemed unchanged, yet he sensed that he was not the same man who had entered it the night before. Something had loosened in him. Something long clenched had finally let go. He walked to the window and opened it. Warm air drifted in, carrying the scent of seawater and distant cooking fires. Below, the city was beginning its slow morning rise, vendors lifting tarp covers from their stalls, taxis weaving through half-empty streets, a group of joggers making their way along the bay. Ordinary life, unfolding with sacred patience. He inhaled deeply, and for the first time in years the breath felt whole. At weigh-in, reporters expected aggression, a final burst of bravado before the match. Instead, they found a version of Rafael they had never seen. He moved calmly, answered questions with sincerity rather than performance, and when asked if he regretted mocking the Filipino spirit, he paused long enough that the room quieted. "I understand now that spirit is not something you can measure," he said. "Not by size, not by strength, and certainly not by arrogance. I spoke out of fear I didn't know I carried." The admission broke the internet within minutes. Some called it weakness, others called it dignity. But for the first time, Rafael was unbothered by the noise. His words were not strategy, they were truth. And truth, he realized, required more courage than any fight he had ever stepped into. Backstage, before the match, he laced his gloves in silence. The noise of the arena pulsed through the walls like a living heartbeat. He could feel the weight of thousands waiting, but instead of shrinking under it, he felt steadied by it. Mateo approached him briefly, offering not a handshake, but a gentle nod. The kind that passed between two men who had walked through different storms and somehow met at the same clearing. "Whatever happens in there," Mateo said softly, "let it not be a battle of anger, but a meeting of purpose." Rafael nodded. "And whatever breaks." He paused, searching for the right words. "May it break toward light." When he stepped into the arena, the roar that greeted him was not the roar he expected. It was not furious, nor mocking. It was layered, curious, watchful, strangely compassionate, as though the crowd sensed, without needing explanation, that the man walking toward the cage was carrying something new. The fight began with a familiar rhythm of movement, the circling, the measuring, the testing of distance. But beneath the technique lived a different undercurrent. Rafael fought not with the frantic need to dominate, but with clarity, with breath, with the grounded presence of someone no longer trying to outrun himself. Every strike he threw came from discipline rather than desperation. Every strike he absorbed came not as insult, but as understanding. Midway through the second round, Mateo landed a clean combination that stunned him. Rafael stumbled back, knees bending, the crowd rising in a wave of anticipation. The old version of him would have met that moment with rage, with reckless retaliation, but now, in the second it took for him to steady his footing, he felt something else, a strange, tender gratitude. He understood, with startling clarity, that strength had never been the truest measure of a man. Humility was, compassion was, the courage to change was. By the third round, both men were marked with bruises, breaths heavy, movements slower but strangely synchronized. It was less a battle, and more a conversation one conducted through flesh, breath, endurance, and the quiet integrity of two men who understood themselves better for having met. When the final bell rang, neither raised their arms. They simply stood facing each other, chests heaving, and then, without needing agreement, embraced. The arena erupted not in triumph, but in something deeper, something that sounded like collective release. The judges awarded the fight to Mateo by a narrow decision, but Rafael did not feel defeated. He felt restored. Later that night, long after interviews and lights and noise had faded, Rafael walked alone to the old church near the bay. The doors were open again. Candles flickered. Shadows danced along the wooden floor. He stepped inside and let the silence greet him like an old friend. He sat in the same pew where he had read Psalm 23. The worn Bible still lay near the altar, left behind by someone who trusted that seekers would find it when they needed it most. He approached it slowly, opened to the page he now knew by heart, and read the verse again, this time not with confusion, not with resistance, but with surrender. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. The words did not strike him like lightning. They settled. They softened. They held him with the quiet assurance of something that had been true long before he discovered it. He closed the Bible gently. Then he whispered, not as a fighter, not as a public figure, not as a man guarding his pride, but as a soul learning its first language of prayer. Thank you for not giving up on me. To want it. Outside, dawn began to lift over Manila's horizon. The first birds stirred. The bay shimmered with early gold. And Rafael stepped out into the morning like someone reborn, not cleansed of struggle, but accompanied by grace. Peace no longer felt like something distant. It lived in the way he breathed, in the way he walked, in the way he looked at the world without flinching. It lived in the humility of having been broken open, and the gratitude of knowing he had not broken alone. He stood at the edge of the road, watching fishermen prepare their nets, children running barefoot with laughter, vendors setting up their stalls with quiet devotion. Ordinary lives, sacred in their simplicity. He smiled, and the smile reached his eyes this time. What about you? What does peace look like in your life? If this story touched you, share it so the light travels further. Silence. Light. Gratitude.